Do you have any guidelines, any advice for the kinds of things that we want to expose our kids to or we want to skip on regarding books, TV shows, movies, documentaries? What would be too much or what would be like too little exposure?
Yeah, that's a question that's complicated, just because, every child is different. And even, as parents, our consciences are going to be different. And Romans 14 makes that clear, that different Christians are going to have convictions over different things. Now, we know there are certain things that are just plain evil. Okay, we're not going to expose our children to sexually explicit content. That's just evil. We're going to, we're going to say no to that in our homes. Then when it has, when we're thinking about, what kind of books or what kind of, shows or what kind of music or what kind of movies are we going to expose our kids to? My main advice would be whatever parents decide to make it a very intentional decision, to make it something that you've actually viewed beforehand. And so you're aware of what's coming up, which I know that's easier said than done. But to make it very, very intentional, that means for some families, anything that has, an element of magic in it, a parent might feel very uncomfortable with that, and they might, decide that, what, if this has any part of magic, we're not going to have that in our home. Where other families might say, what we're going to do is we're going to read through this book and then we're going to talk, about what God says, about supernatural things, that there are supernatural things that he causes. And then there are supernatural things that, other spiritual beings that are God's enemies cause, and so like, let's look at, where does this fall?
We went over witchcraft and magic already. That was one of the things that I first realized that it was so predominant in a lot of movies. I saw you had a blog on Frozen, I think.
Yes.
So I'm looking forward to reading that. Did you want to share a little bit about that just briefly?
Tell you the experience. It was a very interesting experience for me because, I have a small following on my blog, several hundred people, but because everyone had been waiting for Frozen 2 to come out, for like 5 or 6 years, and I happened to release that article the day the movie released. It got, probably like 50,000 views on the first week. And so there was tons of people commenting, and it was so interesting because what I like to do, again, I understand that everyone's going to have different convictions about things, and that's fine. And I wasn't trying to push people into seeing Frozen 2 if they didn't feel right about it. But it was just so interesting because what I like to do is I like to give parents the tools that if they're going to choose to expose their kids to something, how can they have deep, meaningful conversations? Because there's some things in Frozen 2 that Disney did a really good job. It like aligns with the biblical view of, like humanity and the biblical view of love. And then there are some things that are just completely from like a new age perspective, just about, it's more like panentheism, like God being in everything. So I just want to help parents have these conversations. But it was so interesting because there was just all of these comments on the blog of people like accusing me of pushing them into witchcraft, and Satan was behind this blog. And I was just like, oh, this is so very interesting. But I understand that, that people are going to have different convictions about things. And a movie like Frozen 2, that's totally something where some people are going to feel fine taking their kids to it and they can have meaningful conversations. And then other parents who think, what, I just don't feel comfortable taking my kid to see that movie. And, God has given each parent their children, and it's their responsibility to raise them, and so if that's the conviction, then I would say stick with that conviction.
Something I found interesting for the age group that my kids are in is that it seems that even though I have a conversation with them, maybe it doesn't click completely just yet because, for example, we watched a Barbie movie and in it they taught visualization. And as a Christian person, I also asked Jesus to come into my heart at like probably the same age as you. And I haven't really learned like too much about New Age, so I was Googling a few things, and I found it really interesting that they included that, and they were teaching children how to visualize in the movie, indirectly, of course. And what was interesting was I had a conversation with my kids after about it but then they were still playing. And in the things that they were saying, they were visualized that. So it was one of those things where I'm like, okay, maybe I should avoid certain things if they're not old enough to understand it, or maybe just keep having a conversation about maybe don't play visualization, maybe, and it's one of those things where they're so young and they do understand that it's bad, but it's kind of hard, I guess, for them to like really understand that it's not just play, it's not just imagination. And yeah,
Right.
that's kind of a struggle.
That's a great example where different parents are going to have to be discerning. If your children, even after conversations, just take non-biblical parts of entertainment, and incorporate it into their play, then it might be a really great idea to not, not watch that episode or not watch that show or that movie again, where, another child might, watch it and not think another thing about it. So that's really where, discernment and following the Holy Spirit comes in.
Yeah, let's talk about violence and death. Those are also big themes in a lot of these movies, popular movies, especially the ones I grew up watching, the classics with the princesses, and definitely was scary for me as a child, not really understanding how to process the reality of death, for example. And there's definitely no mention about God and heaven in a lot of these movies, so it can be really scary. And in a lot of classic stories, I guess fables, there are certain events that are quite violent and graphic. And one of my kids happens to be very sensitive. And I would be like, let's watch this movie, and it'll be too much for that child. And they won't even want to be in the room, or I'll be in the middle of a story and they'll just want me to stop. So, what do you think as like a teacher? Should we like stop if our child is maybe overly sensitive, or should we just kind of tread slowly? What do you think?
Yeah, that's again where just, discernment is going to come in, and every child is different. So, what your son can handle, might be different than what your daughter can handle. And so you're just going to want to act accordingly. So I would say, especially at that age, 6, 7, 8, when they're really young and if they're sensitive to things, it's a great idea, not to overexpose them. If they're like, stop, please, I want to stop, that's a really good idea. And then when they get older, 9, 10, 11, working through with them, like what are appropriate responses, if you are uncomfortable with what you are seeing, like it's probably not, appropriate, if you're at somebody's house, just like plug your ears and start screaming, but, what is a good response? How can you tell whether it's wise, to get up and to stop, being exposed to that content? Or when is it wise to say, okay, this makes me feel a little uncomfortable and it's a little scary, but I can trust God in this, because I know that God, is always, he's always with me, and I can trust that he's working all things together for good. But especially at those young ages, if they're uncomfortable, it can be a great thing just to stop. Even my oldest nephew, he's very intense and he has a very, very tender heart. And his parents don't do a lot of screen time with him, but they did show him, I think it was Disney's Robin Hood, and there's a scene where the sheriff of Nottingham takes away this little bunny's coin, that he had been given for his birthday. And my nephew saw it and was just like sobbing, because his little heart was breaking for this
Yeah.
bunny and how the sheriff had been so mean. And so my sister-in-law decided, like, oh, you know what? Like, it's so great that he's sensitive to this, but we're going to stop this because, he doesn't need, to be crying throughout the whole movie because of how the sheriff of Nottingham and Prince John are being so mean to all the other people. So at that tender age, it can be a really good idea not to overexpose them. And then as they get older, to just teach them, what are good skills? How do we discern when it's wise to turn something off and to walk away? And how do we discern when it's wise to know, like, okay, I feel really uncomfortable right now, but I can trust God in this, especially as you think through, learning about history. As you learn about different wars and different things that people went through, like there's going to be a lot of things that are uncomfortable there, and we don't need to overexpose them. But even, when they have those feelings of like, oh, I'm scared, I don't like this, knowing like, okay, we can trust that God is sovereign. And even when bad things happen, he's promised to work them together for good for those who love him.
That's a great point. see the good that God can bring out of evil.